Good morning, everybody. We are going to end today our series on Joseph. Sorry, I get my J's mixed up. I want to say Joshua then, but no, it's Joseph. And today we are going to wind it all up so we can move on to something else. So, if you're reading along with me, it's Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 to 24. Just get my Bible. Okay, reading from verse 15 in Genesis chapter 50. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying, 'This you shall say to Joseph: I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face. And they said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and for your little ones.' And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, 'I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, to the land of which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob.' Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, and saying, 'God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here.' So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt." Amen. Ever since the Garden of Eden, there have been those that question the existence of God. I was one for many years. Many who acknowledge that God exists will say that God is distant. He set the universe in motion and then stepped back to see what would happen. In 1990, there was a very popular song sung by Bette Midler, "From a Distance." One of the lines was, "God is watching you from a distance." And the song says that things are not evil in God's sight because he is only watching us, and from a distance things don't look so bad. Theology of the song is wrong on so many different levels. It is completely unbiblical in its stance, and it follows a thing called deism. That's not a new belief about God. It's been around for many, many centuries. Some of the founding fathers of America were deists, like Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson thought Jesus was an actual historical person, a great teacher of morals, but he discounted the miracles that Jesus did. Those that believe in a higher power often take a deist view of things. But a belief that God exists does not make anybody a Christian, nor does it imply that they're saved. You can go to the book of James, chapter 2, in verse 19. You'll read there that James says, "You believe that there is one God. You do well. Even the demons believe and tremble." The fact is that God is interested and involved in every aspect of human activity. And throughout all of human history and throughout all of time, God has been there. And ultimately, God himself enters human history as a man, as the man that we call Jesus. And it is through Jesus that we have salvation, and it is through him that we come to know God. If you ever thought that God was distant and never intervened in anyone's life, the story of Joseph proves, to me anyway, that he does, that he can, and that he will. Today we are looking at evil in the world. People do bad things to us and to others. However, all things are in the hands of God, who can turn the bad around into good. We were looking at Romans 8:28 later on. But you know, the verse from Genesis 50 says God meant it for good. So, a bad situation or an undesirable set of circumstances are not always a bad thing when you're in the hands of God. Way back in 1996, what's that, 24 years ago, good grief, a man had a major problem. He was on a tight schedule to catch an aeroplane out of Miami, and the left rear tyre of his car blew out on the motorway. So for more than an hour he worked at changing the tyre, and just as he'd finished he got a call on his mobile phone, and it was his mother. She said, "Where are you?" He said, I'm stuck on the motorway, I've just got a flat tyre, and I've missed my flight." She said, "Turn on your radio and thank God. The plane that you were going to be on just crashed in the Everglades." He would have been on board that flight except for a flat tyre. We know the verse from Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Let me clarify a few things as this verse says and does not say. First of all, it does not say that everything is good. It does say that God works it all for good, even the bad things. This verse does not say that everything works for good for everyone, but it does say that God works all things for good to those who truly love him, those that are called according to his purpose. A verse from Genesis says pretty much the same. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Put this into a larger context of the Genesis story about Joseph. Joseph was number 11 son out of 12, and I encourage you to read the story of Joseph on your own. It starts in Genesis 37. In context of this verse, when Joseph is about 17 years old, his older brothers hated him because Joseph was their father's favourite. We all know about the coat of many colours, probably from the West End musical. But the older brothers hated him so much because of his dreams that showed Joseph as being superior to them, and because of this coat of many colours, a tunic that showed that Joseph didn't actually do any work. He just watched and made sure everything was done as per his father's wishes. So they faked his death, and they sold him to slave traders who sold him to a man called Potiphar. He had a problem with Potiphar's wife and was thrown into prison unjustly. But God blessed all that Joseph put his hand to. See, as a slave, he rose to a high position. And when he was in prison, he was held in high esteem by the prison keeper. Because God gave Joseph the ability to interpret dreams, he rose to prominence in Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh. Who would have thought it, that somebody who's not Egyptian, who has a prison record, who has an accusation of rape hanging over him in his past, could get to be the Prime Minister of Egypt? Well, there's a great famine in the whole of the Middle East, and Jacob sends Joseph's older brothers to Egypt to buy food, and there they meet Joseph, but they don't recognize him. And you know, it's at this point that Joseph holds their lives in his hand. He kind of has his hand out, and he can squeeze his brothers for what they did to him. He can get his own back on them. And secretly we all like a little bit of revenge. And his brothers were fearful that he might take revenge on them, because the famine It meant everybody moved down to Egypt and settled there. And because the Egyptians hated shepherds, they got one of the best parts of Egypt to themselves. As long as Jacob was alive, this is Joseph's father, the brothers didn't worry that Joseph would repay them for what they did to him. Because, of course, he revealed himself to his brothers. And that's why they were afraid of him. But after Jacob died, that all changed. They sent messengers to Joseph begging forgiveness. And in verse 18, Joseph's brothers go to him in person and throw themselves on the floor before him, actually living out the dream that Joseph had about him standing and the other 11 sheaves of wheat bowing down to him, or him being the sun and the moon and stars, his parents and all his brothers bowing down before him. And so they fulfilled the dream that Joseph had when he was a young man. Joseph could actually have gotten his revenge there and then. It would have been so easy. But he proves himself to be a man of God because he says, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" And now we can bring out the point that vengeance belongs to God and only to God. But that's not where Joseph was going, because he understood, as few do, that the events that happened to him, as terrible as they were, showed that God's hand had been in it all the time. As Genesis 50 verse 20 says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Knowing the whole story, it's easy to see that Joseph's 10 older brothers wanted to do away with him. But God meant it for good, and God worked that bad situation for the good of all and for his glory. Many lives were saved through that famine, and the family of Jacob became a great nation. And God brings triumph out of tribulation and misfortune. But the question still comes up amongst Christians. Why hardship? Why pain? Why my misfortune? You see, Joseph's story teaches us that God's plan is working on our behalf, even when we suffer. Joseph suffered under the injustices of his brothers. His circumstances could have caused him to lose faith, and nobody would have blamed him for that. But his theology, his firm belief in God, caused him to know that God is always good and always at work for our good. The story of Joseph has some lessons for us. Throughout Genesis, God has been working for the good of all creation and the salvation of all people, and this continues throughout the Joseph story. God's love travels to Egypt in the person of Joseph, and he helps to preserve the lives of many people. This story teaches how the power of God works in hidden ways to do what Romans 8:28 says, to work all things together for the good of those who love God. Unlike his ancestors in the faith, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, Joseph does not have any grand visions or any noteworthy conversations with the Lord. Instead, he experiences God very much in the same way that we do, in our hearts and in our minds, and guided by the Holy Spirit. The faith that Joseph has been passed down to him by his father and mother and his community, much the same way as our faith comes to us. And because Joseph is able to trust his faith and trust in God, God works through him. Jesus teaches us that we are to do something difficult. We are to love those who don't love us. We are to love those who would do us harm, love those who have hurt us. And more than that, we are to do good to them, expecting nothing in return. We are to practice radical forgiveness. Forgiveness just the same as Joseph showed to his brothers at the end of today's main reading. That kind of forgiveness is tough, but it's possible. I want to share a true story with you now from 2006 when a man named Charles Roberts walked into a one-room Amish school in a place called Nickel Mines in Pennsylvania, and he executed 5 young girls, injured 5 others, and then took his own life. His father initially thought that they would need to leave the community because they were Amish. How could they miss the signs that their son was the type of person who would do that? But the Amish had a different view. They forgave the Roberts. Even while some of the parents were still waiting to find out what had happened to their daughters, one of the Amish community leaders came to the Roberts house, and he said he knew they were grieving the loss of their child, and he called them friends. That day in Nickel Mines, the past of the Roberts family and the Amish community merged. They reached out to one another in their pain and their grief and their loss, and they bore witness to each other. The Amish did more than forgive. They embraced Roberts' parents as part of their community. Dozens of Amish, including the parents of some of the victims, showed up to form a human chain to block the media from Charlie Roberts' funeral so that his parents could say goodbye to their son. That is one of the most touching things I have ever heard. When Terry Roberts, Charlie Roberts' mother, when she went for stage 4 breast cancer treatment, one of the girls who survived the massacre cleaned her home before she returned from the hospital. Amish school children came and sang carols for her that Christmas. The Roberts have hosted picnics and teas for the Amish community that continue to this day. They are a family brought together out of tragedy. This kind of forgiveness, this kind of love for one's enemies is hard. For the Amish people, it is simply part of living out their faith. Decisional forgiveness is quite simply love for those who should be or are our enemies. We too are called to this kind of forgiveness, even if it is really hard. Just to be clear on this though, decisional forgiveness doesn't mean that we put ourselves back into situations that are harmful or abusive solely for the sake of forgiving our neighbour. Jesus has never asked us to be doormats for abuse or hatred. But even when we need to keep ourselves out of a situation or away from certain people for our own emotional, physical, and even spiritual well-being, we can make the choice to forgive. We can decide to forgive and turn them over to the mercy of God. We can pray for our enemies and love them, even when we have to keep them at arm's length. And as we do this, we will one day find that our pain is somehow different. It becomes part of our story and part of our testimony to the work of God in our lives and in our world, work to bring all things together for good. Thank you very much, and bless you all.